The forest screamed with silence, a deafening void that swallowed David's cries as he stumbled through the underbrush, blood trickling from a gash above his brow. His father's final words echoed in his skull. "You're no son of mine, left to die in the wilds of Montana." David, a 24-year-old with dreams bigger than the small town he'd fled, clung to one truth: he would survive this betrayal, no matter the cost. David's breaths came in ragged bursts, each step a rebellion against the darkness closing in. The late summer air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but it offered no comfort. His father, Pastor John Whitmore, had driven him here under the guise of a fishing trip, only to abandon him miles from civilization with nothing but the clothes on his back, a white t-shirt and jeans now torn from thorns. The betrayal stung worse than the cold biting his skin. John, a pillar of their tight-knit community in Bozeman, had discovered David's secret: his love for another man. To John, it was a sin, a stain on the family name. His solution was to erase David entirely. As dusk painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, David's legs buckled beneath him. He collapsed against a tree, his body trembling from exhaustion and fear. The wilderness was no stranger to him. He'd hiked these trails as a boy, learning to track deer and build fires under his father's watchful eye. But this was different. This was survival, raw and unforgiving. He pressed his hand to the wound on his forehead, wincing as he smeared blood across his knuckles. "Focus, David," he told himself. "You're not dying here." His mind flickered to Ethan, the man who'd changed everything. Ethan, with his warm hazel eyes and easy smile, had walked into David's life 6 months ago at a coffee shop in Missoula. A barista with dreams of becoming a painter, Ethan had a quiet confidence that drew David in like a moth to a flame. Their first kiss, stolen in the alley behind the shop, had felt like freedom. But freedom came at a price. When John found a photo of them together on David's phone, his rage had been apocalyptic. "You're an abomination," he'd spat, before dragging David into the truck and driving him to this godforsaken place. David forced himself to stand, his jaw clenched with determination. He had to keep moving. The forest was vast, but he knew the general direction of the highway. If he could reach it, he might find help. His stomach growled, a reminder of the hunger already gnawing at him. He scanned the ground for anything edible, berries, roots, but the fading light made it impossible to distinguish safe from poisonous. One step at a time, he thought, pushing through the pain. The night deepened, and with it came the cold. David's teeth chattered as he wrapped his arms around himself, his thin t-shirt useless against the dropping temperature. He needed shelter. Spotting a cluster of boulders, he crawled into a shallow crevice, curling up to conserve warmth. The stars above were brilliant, indifferent witnesses to his struggle. As he drifted into a fitful sleep, he clung to the memory of Ethan's voice, soft and steady. "You're enough, David. You've always been enough." Morning broke with a cruel chill. David woke stiff and aching, his body protesting every movement. He dragged himself from the crevice, his breath visible in the crisp air. The gash on his forehead throbbed, but he ignored it, focusing on the faint sound of a distant stream. Water was his first priority. He stumbled toward the sound, his sneakers sinking into the damp earth. When he reached the stream, he dropped to his knees, scooping the icy water into his mouth. It tasted like salvation. As he drank, a rustling in the bushes made him freeze. His heart pounded. Bear, cougar, or worse, his father returning to ensure he was gone for good? But it was only a deer, its eyes wide and curious before it bounded away. David exhaled, relief mixing with the ever-present fear. He couldn't stay still. The highway was his only hope, but every step felt heavier, his strength waning. By midday, the sun offered little warmth, and David's hunger had become a sharp pain in his gut. He remembered his father's lessons. Cattail roots were edible. Spotting a patch near the stream, he dug with his hands, pulling up the starchy roots and chewing them raw. They were bitter, but they dulled the ache. As he ate, he thought of his mother, Sarah, who died when he was 10. She'd been the only one to see him, truly see him, before Ethan. Would she have stood by him, or would she have turned away like John? The question haunted him as he pressed on, the forest stretching endlessly before him. He didn't know how far he was from the highway, but giving up wasn't an option. Ethan was waiting, and David would fight to return to him. Each step was a promise to survive, to expose his father's cruelty, to live unapologetically as himself. The wild might try to break him, but David Whitmore was not so easily erased. The second day in the wilderness carved itself into David's bones. His muscles screamed with every step, and the gash on his forehead pulsed with a dull, persistent ache. Yet, the fire in his chest burned brighter than ever, a refusal to let his father win. The forest was a maze of green, each tree blending into the next. David's sense of direction wavered, but he clung to the faint hope of the highway. He'd seen on the drive-in a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the wilderness, maybe 10 miles from where his father had left him. 10 miles sounded impossible now, with hunger clawing at his insides and his body weakening. But David had never been one to back down. Growing up under John's iron rule had taught him resilience, even if it was born from defiance. He paused to rest against a fallen log, his breath shallow. The memory of Ethan's touch grounded him, the way his fingers had brushed David's cheek during their last night together, hidden in Ethan's tiny apartment. They'd talked about running away, starting fresh in a city where no one knew their names. Seattle, maybe, or San Francisco. Places where love didn't have to hide. But dreams were fragile, and John had shattered theirs with a single act of betrayal. David's thoughts were interrupted by a low growl in the distance. His heart lurched. Wolves. Montana's forests were home to them, and he was in no shape to outrun a pack. He scanned the area, spotting a sturdy branch on the ground. It wasn't much, but he gripped it like a lifeline, his knuckles white. The growling faded, but the encounter left him shaken. He couldn't afford to let fear paralyze him. As the sun climbed higher, David found a cluster of wild blueberries. He ate them greedily, their tartness a fleeting relief. The sugar gave him a burst of energy, enough to keep moving. He followed the stream, knowing it would eventually lead to civilization, or so he hoped. His sneakers were soaked, the cold seeping into his feet. But he pressed on, each step a small victory. By late afternoon, exhaustion threatened to overtake him. His vision blurred, and his legs felt like lead. He stumbled over a root, falling hard to the ground. For a moment, He didn't move, the weight of his situation crushing him. What if I don't make it? The thought was a whisper, insidious and cruel. But then he saw Ethan's face in his mind, heard his laugh, felt the warmth of his embrace. David pushed himself up, dirt smudging his tear-streaked face. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for them. Night fell again, and David found another makeshift shelter, this time under a dense thicket. He curled up, shivering, his mind racing with memories of his father. John had always been a man of absolutes, right and wrong, saved and damned. David had spent his life trying to earn his approval, only to realize it was impossible. Coming out to himself had been a quiet revelation, but it had cost him everything. Or so John thought. As he drifted into sleep, David dreamed of Ethan painting in their imagined future, his hands stained with color, his smile brighter than any sunset. The dream was a lifeline, pulling him through the darkness. He woke to the sound of birds, their calls a reminder that life persisted. Even here, he crawled out of the thicket, his body aching, but his resolve unbroken. The third day brought a glimmer of hope. David spotted tire tracks in the mud, faint but unmistakable. A logging road, maybe, or a hunter's path. His heart raced as he followed them, the ground sloping gently downward. The tracks led to a clearing, and there, in the distance, he saw it, a thin line of asphalt shimmering in the morning light. The highway. Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't let himself celebrate yet. He was still miles from safety, and his body was failing him. The gash on his forehead was infected, red and swollen, and fever was setting in. He needed help, and fast. As he staggered toward the road, a distant rumble grew louder. A truck. David waved his arms, his voice hoarse as he shouted for help. The truck slowed, and a weathered man leaned out, his eyes widening at the sight of David's battered form. "Kid, what the hell happened to you?" the driver asked, stepping out to help. David collapsed into his arms, the world fading to black. But even as he slipped into unconsciousness, one thought burned bright. He was alive, and he would make his father answer for this. David woke to the sterile hum of a hospital room, the antiseptic smell sharp in his nose. His body ached, but the warmth of the bed and the steady beep of a monitor told him he was safe. For now. The truck driver, a grizzled logger named Tom, had saved his life, driving him straight to a small clinic in Bozeman. The infection in his wound had nearly killed him, but antibiotics and rest were pulling him back from the edge. As his vision cleared, David saw Ethan sitting beside him, his hazel eyes red-rimmed with worry. "You're awake," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking as he reached for David's hand. The touch was electric, grounding David in a way the forest never could. He squeezed back, tears spilling down his cheeks. "I thought I'd lost you," Ethan said, leaning forward to press a gentle kiss to David's knuckles. "I made it," David rasped, his throat dry. "For you." Ethan's smile was fragile but radiant. He'd been searching for David since John had lied to the town, claiming his son had run off to start over. Ethan hadn't believed it. He'd gone to the police, but with no evidence of foul play. They dismissed him. It was Tom's call to the clinic that had brought Ethan running, his heart in his throat. The doctor, a kind woman named Dr. Patel, checked David's chart. "You're lucky to be alive," she said, her voice firm but warm. "The infection was severe, and you were dehydrated. We'll keep you here a few days." David nodded, grateful but restless. His father's betrayal loomed large, a shadow he couldn't shake. He needed to confront John, to expose him, but he was too weak to act yet. Ethan stayed by his side, recounting the days David had been missing. The town had buzzed with rumors, some calling David a runaway, others whispering darker theories. John had played the grieving father, preaching sermons about forgiveness while hiding his crime. The hypocrisy made David's blood boil. He told Ethan everything: the fake fishing trip, the abandonment, the days of hunger and fear. Ethan listened, his jaw tight, his hands trembling with suppressed rage. "We'll make him pay," Ethan said, his voice low but fierce. "Not just for you, but for everyone he's hurt with his hate." David nodded, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. Bozeman was full of kids like him, suffocated by families who saw love as a sin. If he could expose John, he could give them hope. But first, he needed to heal. Over the next few days, David regained his strength. Ethan brought him books, sketched portraits of him on napkins, and whispered promises of a future together. They planned in hushed tones, knowing John's influence in the town ran deep. The pastor was a charismatic figure, his church a cornerstone of the community. Taking him down would require more than David's word. It would need proof. On the 5th day, David was discharged. Ethan drove him to a small motel on the edge of town, a temporary safe haven. David's apartment was no longer safe. John had keys, and David didn't trust him not to come after him again. As they settled in, Ethan pulled out his laptop, showing David a folder of photos, screenshots of texts between David and John, including one where John had called him a disgrace days before the trip. It wasn't enough to convict, but it was a start. David's mind churned with ideas. He remembered his father's meticulous journals, kept in the study at home. If John had written anything about his plan, it could be damning. But getting into the house would be risky. John was rarely alone, and the church community watched his every move. Still, David knew the house's layout: the creaky floorboards, the hidden spare key under the porch. That night, as they lay together on the motel bed, Ethan traced circles on David's palm. "We don't have to do this alone," he said. "There's a lawyer in Missoula who takes cases like this: hate crimes, family violence. I looked her up. She's good." David turned to him, hope flickering in his chest. "You think she'd believe me?" "She'll believe us," Ethan said, his voice steady. "And we'll make sure the world does, too." The next morning, they drove to Missoula, the city's vibrant energy a stark contrast to Bozeman's quiet judgment. The lawyer, Maria Gonzalez, was a fierce woman with a reputation for fighting for the marginalized. She listened to David's story, her eyes narrowing as he described John's actions. "If we can get those journals," she said, "we've got a case. But we need to move carefully. Your father's a powerful man." David felt a surge of purpose. He was no longer the boy begging for his father's approval. He was a man fighting for his truth, for his love, for his life. And he wasn't alone. The plan was reckless, but David was done playing safe. Under the cover of night, he and Ethan parked a block from John's house. the familiar craftsman looming like a ghost from David's past. The journals were their only shot at hard evidence, and David knew exactly where to find them, locked in a desk drawer in the study. They waited until the lights in the house went out. John's routine as predictable as ever. Ethan gripped David's hand, his voice a whisper. "You don't have to do this. We can find another way." "There is no other way," David said, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. "He tried to kill me. I'm taking him down, using the spare key." They slipped inside, moving silently through the darkened house. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a gunshot, but David's memory guided them to the study. The desk was old, its lock flimsy. Ethan kept watch as David pried it open with a letter opener, his heart pounding. Inside were the journals, their leather covers worn from years of use. He flipped through the most recent one, his eyes scanning John's tight, angry handwriting. There it was, a confession, chilling in its clarity. "Davidson cannot be cleansed. I left him to God's judgment in the wild." It was the only way. David's hands shook as he read, rage and relief crashing together. This was it, the proof they needed. He tucked the journal under his jacket, but as they turned to leave, headlights swept across the windows. John was home early. "Hide," Ethan hissed, pulling David behind a bookshelf. Footsteps echoed in the hall, heavy and deliberate. John's voice carried through the house, speaking to someone on the phone. "No, he's gone for good. The town believes he ran off. Let's stay that way." David's blood ran cold. His father wasn't just covering his tracks, he was rewriting the narrative. The call ended, and John entered the study, flipping on the light. David held his breath, Ethan's hand tied on his arm. If John noticed the open drawer, they were done for. But he didn't. He grabbed a book from the shelf and left, the door clicking shut behind him. They waited, hearts pounding, until the house was silent again. Then they slipped out, the journal burning a hole in David's jacket. Back at the motel, they read it together, each page a testament to John's hatred. He'd planned the abandonment for weeks, convinced it was his divine duty. The words were a knife in David's heart, but they were also his weapon. The next day, they met with Maria again. She read the journal, her expression grim. "This is enough for a criminal case," she said. "Attempted murder, hate crime charges. But we need to go public too. Your father's influence won't crumble quietly." David hesitated. Going public meant exposing himself, his love, his pain, to a town that might turn on him. But Ethan's steady presence gave him courage. "I'm ready," David said. "I want everyone to know what he did." Maria worked fast, filing charges and contacting a local journalist, Sam Carter, who'd written about hate crimes before. Sam was eager to tell David's story, but he warned them of the backlash. "Bozeman's conservative. Some will stand by your father, no matter the evidence." "Let them," David said, his voice fierce. "I'm done hiding." The article hit the local paper like a bomb. "Pastor's son left to die in wilderness over sexuality." The headline screamed. Sam had included excerpts from the journal, anonymized to protect the case, but the town knew who it was about. Protests erupted outside John's church, some in support of David, others decrying him as a liar. Social media exploded, with "Justice for David" trending alongside hateful slurs. John's response was swift, a public sermon denying everything, painting David as a troubled runaway. But the journal's existence was undeniable, and whispers of doubt spread through the congregation. David watched it unfold from the motel, his heart a tangle of fear and hope. Ethan stayed close, his presence a reminder that love could be a shield as much as a target. As a legal battle loomed, David and Ethan prepared for the fight of their lives. Maria warned them it wouldn't be easy. John had hired a top lawyer, and the town was divided. But David felt a fire he'd never known before. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was fighting back. The courtroom was a battlefield, its wooden benches packed with spectators from both sides of Bozeman's divide. David sat beside Maria, his hands clasped tightly to hide their trembling. Across the room, John stared straight ahead, his face a mask of righteous calm. The journal lay on the evidence table, its pages a silent accusation. Maria's opening statement was searing. John Whitmore didn't just abandon his son, she said, her voice cutting through the room. He tried to erase him, to punish him for who he loves. This isn't just a crime, it's a betrayal of family, of humanity. The jury, a mix of stoic farmers and city transplants, listened intently, their faces unreadable. David took the stand on the second day, his heart pounding as he recounted the ordeal. The forest, the hunger, the fear, it spilled out in a rush, his voice breaking as he described his father's cold farewell. He said, "I wasn't his son anymore," David said, meeting John's eyes for the first time. "But I'm still here. I survived." The defense painted David as unstable, a liar seeking attention. John's lawyer produced character witnesses, church members who swore the pastor was a saint. But the journal was their Achilles heel. When Maria presented it, reading John's own words aloud, the courtroom fell silent. "I left him to God's judgment," she quoted, her voice steady. "This is not judgment. This is attempted murder." Ethan testified next, his voice trembling but resolute. He spoke of their love, of the fear they'd lived with, of the moment he learned David was missing. "I thought I'd lost him," he said, tears in his eyes. "But he came back, and he's stronger than anyone in this room." David's chest ached with pride and love, watching Ethan bare his soul to a room full of strangers. The trial stretched over weeks, each day a test of David's endurance. Outside, protests grew louder, with supporters holding signs reading "Love is not a sin" clashing with those shouting about divine retribution. Ethan and David stayed at the motel, avoiding the chaos, but the weight of the town's judgment pressed down on them. Late at night, they held each other, whispering dreams of a future where they could walk hand in hand without fear. A surprise witness turned the tide. Emily, a former church secretary, came forward with a recording of John ranting about cleansing David's sin months before the incident. She'd kept it secret, afraid of John's power, but David's story gave her courage. The recording was damning, and the jury's faces shifted, doubt creeping in where loyalty once stood. As closing arguments loomed, David felt a strange peace. He'd told his truth, and the world was listening. Win or lose, he'd exposed John's hypocrisy. But the stakes were high. If John walked free, David and Ethan might never be safe in Bozeman. Maria was confident, but juries were unpredictable, especially in a town torn between tradition and change. On the final day, David and Ethan sat in the courtroom, hands clasped under the table. The jury filed in, their faces somber. The foreperson stood, clearing her throat. "On the charge of attempted murder," she said, "we find the defendant guilty." A gasp rippled through the room. John's mask cracked, his shoulders slumping as the verdict sank in. David exhaled, tears streaming down his face. Ethan pulled him close, whispering, "We did it." The courtroom erupted, supporters cheering, others shouting in protest. But David only saw Ethan, his anchor in the storm. The judge sentenced John to 7 years, a punishment that felt both heavy and insufficient. As John was led away, he looked at David, his eyes empty of remorse. David met his gaze, unyielding. He wasn't a scared boy in the forest anymore. He was a survivor. Outside, reporters swarmed, but David and Ethan slipped away, driving to a quiet park on the edge of town. They sat on a blanket by a lake, the same one they dreamed of during David's darkest moments. The sunset painted the sky gold, and for the first time in weeks, they breathed freely, their hands intertwined. The verdict was only the beginning. Bozeman buzzed with the fallout. The town split between those who saw John's conviction as justice and those who called it a witch hunt. David and Ethan stayed in Missoula, where the air felt lighter, the judgment less suffocating. They rented a small apartment above a bookstore, a space filled with Ethan's canvases and David's growing collection of journals, not his father's, but his own, filled with poetry and dreams of a new life. David became a voice for others. He spoke at rallies, his story resonating with kids who'd been cast out, lovers who'd been shamed. The hashtag Justice for David evolved into Love Wins Montana, a movement that spread across the state. Letters poured in from strangers, thanking him for his courage, sharing their own stories of survival. Each one reminded David why he'd fought, not just for himself, but for a world where love didn't come with a death sentence. Ethan's art took on new life, his paintings capturing the raw beauty of their journey. One piece, a portrait of David emerging from the forest, was displayed at a Missoula gallery, drawing crowds who saw in it a story of resilience. David stood beside him at the opening, proud and unafraid, their hands clasped openly for the first time. But healing wasn't linear. Nightmares still woke David, his father's voice echoing in the dark. Therapy helped, as did Ethan's unwavering presence. They built a life together, small but vibrant, filled with quiet moments, cooking dinner, dancing to old records, planning a future beyond Montana. Seattle was still a dream, but felt closer now, tangible. A year after the trial, David returned to Bozeman for the first time. He spoke at a community center, a place once tied to his father's church, but now hosting support groups for LGBTQ youth. The room was packed, faces young and old, some tearful, others hopeful. David told his story, not as a victim, but as a survivor. "I was left to die," he said, his voice steady. "But I chose to live. And you can too." Afterward, a teenage boy approached, his eyes nervous but determined. "My dad's like yours was," he whispered. "I don't know what to do." David listened, his heart aching, and gave him Maria's card. "You're not alone," he said, meaning it. The boy nodded, a spark of hope in his eyes. Back in Missoula, David and Ethan sat by their apartment window, watching snow dust the streets. The journal that had convicted John sat on a shelf, a reminder of the past, but no longer a chain. David had written a new entry that morning, a letter to his younger self. You are enough. You always were. As they sipped coffee, Ethan reached for David's hand. What's next? He asked, his smile warm. David looked out at the world, no longer a wilderness but a canvas of possibility. Everything, he said, leaning in for a kiss. They'd survived the worst. And now, they would live fully, fiercely, and unapologetically. The story of David Whitmore wasn't just about survival. It was about love that refused to be erased, about a town forced to confront its shadows, about a man who turned pain into purpose. He'd been left to die, but he returned, not with vengeance, but with truth. And in that truth, he found freedom, not just for himself, but for everyone who dared to love in a world that sometimes forgot how.